Hi everyone, welcome back to Ask Confluent, the show where we answer Kafka questions from the internet. And with me today, I have my beloved co-host, Tim Berglund.
Hi, Gwen.
And we have a special guest.
We do.
Hello, Internet. It's Viktor, long-time listener, first-time caller.
So Viktor is the newest member of Team's team.
That is correct. Developer advocate here at Confluent. Delighted to have Viktor on the team.
Delighted to be finally on this podcast, guys. Sorry, but I have to plug it because I love the show.
He's pretty excited.
Yes. And you're going to see him all over the world. If you did not yet see him all over the world, you are going to, because we're going to basically be sending him to speak all over the place.
We keep this guy busy.
He'll talk about Kafka and KSQL and Kubernetes and clouds and all the cool stuff. So let's ask him some questions.
What are we talking about here today? Yeah.
So question from our friend of Confluent, Alex Ott, who's a very friendly, one of our tweeps.
That would be fair to say.
Yes.
Alex, thank you, by the way.
He asks, is it possible to extract information about Windows start time generated by aggregation with KSQL if I consume the topic from a normal client, presumably a consumer, and not KSQL?
Yes, may I?
Yes, go for it.
So you've got, just to frame that if you don't understand the question, when you've got a KSQL query and it's a persistent query, it's going to produce its results back to a Kafka topic. So you'll say something like create table monkey as select blah, 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 and there's an aggregation happening there. I think you said aggregation in the question, right? Yeah, there's an aggregation. So you're making a table, and that table is the result of an aggregation on a stream. And in KSQL, you think, well, it's a table, I'll deal with it as a table, but that table has an underlying Kafka topic. Those messages are being produced to that topic all the time. So if you want to access them from something which is not KSQL, you can do that. That's one of the cool things about KSQL is it's just a Kafka topic. You can have a conventional consumer then go consume from that, or you can Kafka Connect it, or you can do whatever you want. It's just a topic, right? So, and the question is, can I get at the aggregation, the window start time in those aggregated results? Because there's the window, obviously, if there's an aggregation. Anyway, all that to say, yes. Next question. No, okay, let's try a little bit more detailed than that. The answer is yes, you can get at those things. And our friend and occasional podcast guest and colleague, Hojat Jafarpour, answered this actually on Twitter as well. There is a SERDI called the windowed key SERDI. And if you use that, then it's basically you're like looking at the results as a windowed thing, and that window time is a part of the key, and you can get that back. So you use the windowed key SERDI, and when you're consuming from that topic, and you get what you want. So it's a lengthy answer, but to a very good and specific question.
What do you say, Viktor? He got it right?
Yeah. So
you're not just saying it because he's your boss?
No. One of the things that probably some people can notice if they start consuming this, like a KSQL produced topics, that's some additional columns. In general, they're not there, but like if you want to read this from the conventional client, you need to use like specific serializer to understand what exactly is there, because Kafka doesn't really care what's inside. It's only your app. So your app needs to understand. And for that matter, we have a special deserializer that will bring the thing and make it more sensible.
Okay, next question. Tamer asks, is there such a thing as oversubscribing to Kafka? Where do we draw the line and how? So I think everyone has their own opinion about how much subscribing is oversubscribing.
Oversubscribing like consumers? Or like,
that's what I thought. Do you have a different interpretation? For me, you have consumers, they subscribe. How else do you oversubscribe?
Yeah, I thought maybe like, can I give it too big of a place in my heart? That's probably not.
Obviously, no.
Obviously not that. But yeah, okay. So consumer fan out.
That was my guess. Like because something like Kinesis limits your fan out quite a lot.
Profoundly.
Yes.
Yes. So.
Idea about Kafka again is that we have a lot of readers, much more readers than actual producers. So this is why essentially Kafka is designed to be like oversubscribed. Like I I can assume that this question comes from many people who has a traditional messaging background, where they think, okay, so if my broker will do the push to me, do they actually destroys by multiple, like hundreds of consumers? So they need to do like a push for hundreds of the subscribers. Kafka works a little bit different. So I don't think it's kind of like oversubscribing. Another thought about oversubscribing is like putting a lot of use cases around this.
Yes. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You want to have a lot of use cases around it.
And so I'm always tempted to say no too, right? Because again, architecturally, brokers themselves don't know who's listening. They don't need to know who's consuming. There are just requests that come in for messages in a partition at an offset, and consumers are managing that. And as long as from a raw pub sub standpoint, they can get the work done and everybody's CPU and IO and disk and everything are utilized in a happy way, the answer is no. The fan out is infinite, and that's always the answer you want to give. But then you dig into a question like this, and we have not dug into Tamer's question, but then they're like, oh yeah, because I wanted one per user, and I've got 750,000 users. Is that okay? And so,
and I'm sending files to Kafka.
Right.
And so there's always the thing that even though you can, should you do it? Is that a good idea?
This is perfect.
We need to say this in the Jeff Goldblum voice. We didn't stop to think whether we should. Jurassic Park. So where does it fall down? Right? There's like metadata. There's the consumer offsets topic. I mean, what if you just crank the exponent in ridiculous ways? Where do you fall down with lots and lots of consumers? Where would you guys predict?
Well, in my favorite answer to this. If you cannot measure, you cannot control it. So if you know what exactly your numbers you're targeting here, like how many consumers, and you can project at some point, because Kafka has this ability, you can project that growth. And this is what we usually suggest people to do. Is
maybe
just,
even
measure.
Use Confluent Control Center to monitor your bottleneck, because we can guess auto bottleneck. I mean, my guess was probably CPU, but possibly network connections.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows? You need to have a tool for measuring it.
So watch it and turn the crank and see, because I'm guessing there is something behind the question where somebody's wanting to go crazy.
A lot of times, you go to people like on Twitter, you ask how many consumers do you have. And people say, oh, I have 30,000 consumers. I have 50,000 consumers. And they say, interesting, how big is your cluster? And they say, well, 5. I have 100 brokers. So you have to remember that at the end of the day, hardware is hardware, a machine is a machine. If you want to go with a lot of consumers, you may need to have a larger cluster too.
Got it.
Okay, next question from David Newberg, who is Newberger. Very good friend of mine on Twitter, and shows up at random Kafka conferences. Like, we know him, we like him. He asked, generally speaking, is it more costly to upconvert or downconvert message formats for messages sent to Kafka? And this was a response from me tweeting, hey, we have a new guy on the podcast. Let's ask him really hard questions. What's the hardest question you have?
And before you answer the question, what does that mean? Make sure everybody...
We are totally going to explain, because this is a question that Viktor and I had to go to the experts. So thank you, Jason and Ismail, Kafka committers, Kafka PMC members, for explaining everything about up conversion and down conversion, because it turned out to be a lot trickier. My first guess was that it's identical. It's going to be exactly the same thing. What's the difference? Up convert, down convert, same thing. And it turned out that I was dead wrong.
Okay, so Viktor, is it better to give or to receive? Over to you.
Let's dissect this question. So first of all, a couple things what I like to do before I'm jumping to the conclusion, jumping to the answers, is to figure out what exactly this gentleman means in terms of cost for whom. And we did this assumption that we're talking about Kafka brokers, and let's talk about this. And never go to the Ask Confluent show unprepared. So I prepared a little bit of props. So let's talk about this. Let's dissect it. So first important things, that this is how you draw Kafka in your diagrams. You're not using tubes, bricks, and stuff like that. This is Kafka broker. So, and let's assume we have a Kafka broker with version 1.1. So we have a producer with older version, which is 0.1. And we assume that when we publish this message to Kafka broker, this is what we meant by up converting. We need to bring the format of the message that we have from producer to the internal message format that broker supports. So in this case, we're going to be having upconvert. Now, on the other side,
because of a version mismatch in producer and consumer.
So we will talk about this, but
right.
just right now, I'm just trying to establish like baseline and common vocabulary so we can talk the things through.
Okay.
On the other side, we have a consumer that also has a version of the message different from version of the broker. So and we say that when a broker has a different version from the consumer, we need to do down consumption. Why is that? Why we need to do this? So first of all, important thing that Gwen taught me is that first thing that every client will do during handshake, they receive the version. So in this particular case, producer will receive version of the broker, and it will establish version of protocol because producer version is higher. Producer can know.
Can I nitpick? 0.9 is a bit too old to know the version of the broker. So the broker in this case has to do all the work. I think we only added the version protocol in either 0.10 or 0.11. I think 0.10.
Okay.
So if you have
late.
a 0.9 client, it will just send the old version regardless. Everything else in the diagram actually uses the version check.
Yeah. Okay. And in this particular case, it's going to be up converting. So
yes.
Broker will bring the message format to the message format that broker has in configuration.
Yep.
By default, if you're not specifying anything, it will use whatever is version of Kafka broker. Now, in the down convert, we will use the message format that consumer supports. Now, what is more costly? In this case, it's also, I like the segue from the previous question where we're talking about oversubscribing. And one of the things that we usually tell about Kafka is that we produce less that we consume. We read more. The thing that we already mentioned here is a consumer fan out, when we have more consumers that we usually, produce. So in this case,
remember, Kafka is an author. He wrote his book once.
Exactly.
Millions of people read it all over the world.
Exactly. This is pretty good metaphor for.
I learned it from a very smart new developer advocate that we got.
we can talk about this, but essentially, another thing that will affect performance of the broker and add a little bit cost here is that message needs to be stored in memory. So when we're talking about like a typical producer and consumer, they have a same version. In this case, the message will be streamed from the file to the socket. This is what we call zero copy. Now, in this case, we're losing zero copy because message needs to be read into a heap of the broker, needs to be converted to the specific format, and after that will be sent.
So that'll be a copy and a copy.
Yes, and this will grow exponentially. Depends of number of consumers and depends of the version of this consumer. So in this case, it will be doing this for every consumer that will connect it here.
And before 2.0, we were really bad at doing it in some ways. So you could actually cause garbage collection pressure, run out of memory. It used to be pretty painful.
By having client and broker version mismatches.
Yes.
Okay.
Especially if you
and
have
I remember
a lot
this
of those consumers.
from the release notes of 2 now, talking about this. Yes.
Exactly.
And I remember this from very awesome talk that I learned from Kafka Summit London when the Gwen and Xavier were talking about monitoring. And one of the use cases was explained in this talk. You just go and find this. How we do this? Like find the link below. In this talk, you will learn what kind of things to monitor and what kinds to see if you do like this upgrading of versions and things like that. Now, let's talk a little bit about like new stuff. Like if we're running producer and consumer version higher than version of the broker, will there something like this happen? It turns out that Kafka producer and consumer, Kafka clients, they're very smart. And one of the things that I already mentioned and the Gwen mentioned, that they communicate and they negotiate the version. So in this case, producer with higher version know more about broker with older version. So in this case, producer will just operate on the same protocol level as a broker. So in this case, there would be no hit in the both sides. In this case, they will be just talking to the version that the protocol supports. So this is what I like about, it's kind of like shows the metaphor of developer experience team. So we lift people up. We don't let them down. So we're providing.
Am I
some
right,
information.
internet?
Yeah. So this is a picture that we drew before the show. I hope it explains what we're trying to say here.
I think that was great.
But last but not least, always be measuring. So if you cannot measure something, you cannot control it. So that's why you probably need to do your own test, because it really depends. In theory, it works.
And now we have new metrics to tell you exactly how many clients of which version you have connecting to Kafka. So this is all good.
Confluent Control Center.
Yes?
Yes.
No, not in no. Oh. Actually, no.
Oh, not visible. Okay, but new JMX metric.
And JMX.
Yes.
Okay, also in JMX.
Kafka.
Yeah.
Yeah, the nice thing is that this really informs how you do upgrades. Because now that you know that the worst things that can possibly happen to Kafka is old consumers, and all producers are only the second worst thing to happen to Kafka, you know that you have to hunt down and upgrade all the consumers first, which is a problem because there is a lot more of them. But upgrades are a pain.
I already advanced for you.
Yes, thank you.
I'm jumping
so nice.
the gun.
I said you're the best co-host ever. So, next question. Can you please give some recommendations on using Kafka headers? When should I put event metadata in the event itself? And when should I use headers for that? So people have been asking for headers in Kafka since at least version 0.8 when I joined.
That's when, right.
We only added them at version 0.11. So kind of makes you wonder what happened in between to make people change their mind.
A lot of no.
A lot of no happened in between. And it used to be that like the biggest Kafka player at the time was LinkedIn. As they owned most of the Kafka developer, not all of it, but a lot. And for LinkedIn, they basically did what Marek Gerhardt suggests. Why don't we just put all the information, all the metadata in the event itself? And LinkedIn was using Avro at the time, so they just had kind of a standardized Avro extras that they included everywhere, and all their Avro schemas included it, and it was fine. But LinkedIn grew a lot. Time passed. People left the company, started new companies, who knows? And it turned out that new teams didn't want to use Avro. And between us, who can blame them? And they wanted to use things like JSON and protobuf, but there were centralized teams that needed the metadata from every single message going to Kafka. For example, the team that is responsible for how many events are produced by this application versus the other application, they didn't want to learn, you're doing Avro and you're doing JSON, you're doing protobuf, and let me figure out all of that. They needed something very standardized. So headers give you the ability to have something that is standardized across the various different message formats that go around in your company. And this happened to be a huge deal. But since you're asking not just when to use, whether to put metadata in the event or in the header, I think the good question is, what do people do in the headers? What do you want to use them for? And I heard that Viktor has a lot of experience with customers and actually know what people use it for.
And opinions. Right.
I always have opinion about something, so this is what we call the opinionated developer advocate. So one of the things that the Gwen mentioned, that usually putting some metadata for perspective of audit, for perspective of tracing, for perspective of lineage, this is something that people putting in the special format. For example, Spring Framework use this concept of headers, which is not called headers, and they were not available in the Kafka. I'm talking right now about the Spring Kafka library. Shameless plug. Come to see me talking about Spring Kafka at the Spring Platform conference next month in September, if you will be in the Washington, D.C. Another use case that you can use, they use it in the Spring Cloud Stream to do routing, basically. So based on this header, you can specify
always cross-cutting things, though.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And one of the things that Gwen mentioned is for many, for few organizations, apparently there's legal implications where you cannot read the content of the message. So in this case, it should be somewhere outside, and header is the perfect place.
Okay.
In terms of all these regulations with the data dealing with data and things like that.
Yeah.
Another thing that I recently learned that the frameworks like Open Tracing that has a Kafka client, that they use headers to put this like a trace ID. So in this case, you
That
can
makes a lot
show
of
this
sense.
information.
Yeah, because OpenTrace doesn't want to care about your message format and whether you use JSON or other.
Yeah, precisely.
It's also used for lineage. I think that's pretty common. It's kind of like Open Tracing, but slightly different. A lot of time you need to know who produced the message. Again, sometimes for legal reasons, sometimes for GDPR reasons. Message that was produced in Europe may not be legal to replicate it into the United States. So now Replicator, for example, has to be aware of the headers and rules around them.
Yeah. So a couple of things that with headers right now, pretty much every framework support this in terms of like producers, consumers,
streams, Connect, everyone.
For streams, we recently added support of headers in the processor API. So you have
but
ability.
What about KSQL?
This is a good question. This will take some time to research for us. We'll
get back to you.
Yeah. I don't think KSQL uses this right now, but this is really, really good. Really good use case for taking care of things not related to data, like when some other people needs to manage the
encryption
flows.
keys. That's a good place to put your public encryption key. So.
This is an interesting idea. Yeah, it's probably worth to explore.
Yes.
But the basic idea is when it's a cross-cutting concern like lineage, or provenance, stuff like that.
And if I may add a little bit interactivity to our podcast, go right in the comments if you're using headers and why you're using headers and how you're using headers. So it would be also interesting to know how the people
you may be on a future episode if it's good. So make it good.
We love stories. Okay, and I think last question for this episode. This is a question for our previous episode.
This is
where we talked about
an Italian named Scarface.
I thought it's just Scarface.
Scarface.
Isn't
548.
It?
Okay.
Yeah, it's like I think there's the Disney thing with lions.
Yeah, that's Scar.
Oh, it's not Scarface?
Then there was a film called Scarface.
Got it.
Starring Al Pacino.
There was a Dark Knight where there was a character who was asking, "Do you want to know how I get the scars?"
Yes.
We do not want to know how to get the scars.
But
yeah, this is a family-friendly show. We do not want to talk about scars here. But Scarface has a question about storing data in Kafka forever, because we keep saying that, we give a lot of examples saying that it's okay or it's a good idea and why not really. And then he says, well, it's a good idea, but it's expensive. At work, I have to use RAID disks, which are expensive.
Yes, that's a way to spend money.
And then he has two concerns. First, about just storing data forever is not cheap. But also, if you want to use something like Kafka Streams and go and process historical data, Kafka Streams itself has its own state, which also uses storage. So there's somehow compounded concerns. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. There's I think there is an implied proposition that's not stated that we need to state. And he says, well, if it's so expensive to store data in Kafka, then we're going to have to use Spark to do our data processing. The implication there is that the data is going to live when I'm doing Spark. I'm going to put the data somewhere that's cheaper, right? And that's, of course, HDFS, which is always the silent partner of Spark.
Silent partner?
We never say HDFS. We say Spark because it sounds cool. But
HDFS is kind of dead. All the cool kids are doing S3 these days.
So there you go. Okay. So somewhere cheaper.
Yes.
Right? And
maybe with Cassandra. Is Cassandra cheaper than Kafka?
It absolutely not. No, in terms of storage. It's byte for byte.
So HDFS and S3 are
you would
cheap
not,
storage.
Yeah, Cassandra wouldn't even come up here.
Yeah.
Right. So you're doing you're doing Spark over just something cheap. And if you're using RAID in your Kafka cluster, well, then that's not cheap, right? And that's those other things, whether it's a legacy HDFS thing or it's S3, those are already getting the replication done for you, right? So you don't think, oh no, this needs to be RAID. It's just a file system that replicates. Well, folks, so does Kafka, right? So one of the things here is that running Kafka on RAID is probably a more expensive way to run Kafka than you need
Yeah,
to.
and it used to be that you pretty much needed that because Kafka Broker would not survive a loss of a disk, but that's no longer true. Starting at
is
I
no
think
longer true.
1.1. So definitely all of you move to JBOD and run Kafka on the chip.
On the cheap, yeah. So that kind of gets you out of that. Now, more broadly, is storing data in Kafka over the long term going to cost more than S3 buckets? Yes, right? Because there's just more going on in a Kafka broker than a file system, a distributed file system. So there's definitely a cost differential there, and long term you're going to have higher costs. But let's not make them worse, right? And there are interesting things going on in the community, thinking about like what happens. Is there a cold storage option, and how does this really work when your data is supposed to live in Kafka forever, whatever that means?
Here's an interesting thought for you guys. We can say you not have to have all data stored in Kafka forever. So because every topic has its own retention policy, so some of the data can be short-lived. You don't need to store, for example, for eternity, some of the intermediate topics where you do some processing.
But so my business does require a lot of long-term analysis. For example, is my marketing campaign this winter better than my marketing campaign 5 years ago? If I don't store it on Kafka, I have to store it somewhere, and now I have to use both Kafka streams and Spark, and I really don't want to use Spark.
And you don't want to do both, yeah. So I mean, if so, be thoughtful about that. The question seems to imply that there is a business. It
sounds like he needs historical data
or regulatory reason that
if you
it
don't
needs
need
to live for a
historical
long
data,
time.
your life is way easier.
Yeah, and certainly. And Gwen, you had mentioned Kafka Streams and its storage requirements in that are not long term, but persisting its the state store stuff onto disk, and
that can definitely be on cheap disks.
Please don't do that on RAID. Yes, if that's on a RAID volume, then that's just money you don't need to spend, right? So there are some things that kind of blunt the force of the objection a little bit, that can make things a little cheaper, and long term. Certainly things the community is looking at.
And I've even seen people use a different cluster for the streams state stores than they do for the rest of the data, like the actual inputs and outputs.
Really?
And let's not forget Kafka Connect. So you can use best of both worlds. If your organization might use in HDFS, let's face it, many organizations use it, and you need to use historical data. You not need to use historical data every day. If you do writing reports, you can have this as a part of your pipeline. You can feed data from HDFS using Connect. Do your processing. You have few topics with 2016, 2015, 2014.
I think that's a fantastic idea.
And after that, you run this processing in the Kafka streams or Spark.
And
or
when
whatever.
you're done, you can drop them. And
exactly. Yeah. And you can also using a connector to offload this back to HDFS, so it will wait until next year when you need to do these books.
Yeah.
Fantastic suggestion. I think. Oh, I thought we were.
It's one more. The Spark versus Kafka thing. Like there is a place in the world for analysis of static data, for like experimental analysis of static data. That's not real time. No, you don't even think so?
I mean, in my ideal world, streaming can do things across a lot of time horizons, and it's good to be like as a developer. I think that if I build expertise on one tool, it's kind of good to use it for all its worth, right? And like Spark is not easy. Kafka Streams is not 100% trivial.
Let's do one of them, yeah. And where I was going with that was,
if it's capable of, right?
If it's a real-time system, an event-driven system you're trying to build, like maybe there's a place for this analysis of static data where data scientists can experiment in Python and things like that. But that's never going to be an event-driven system. Like you can't make Spark into that, even in our opinion, with Spark streaming. So it's the should I use Kafka or Spark? Yeah. I'm kind of starting to see that as that's really the wrong question.
It's Lambda architecture versus Kappa architecture in a way, right? Lambda says you need batch and streaming separate. Kappa says streaming is a superset or includes a batch. And I'm kind of a Kappa architecture kind of person.
Are. And if in fact streaming is what you need to do, then it's not really a question, right? At that point, it's Kafka and Kafka streams.
So I think we're good here. We answered a bunch of questions. We had very interesting debates for sure.
Definitely.
That was fun. Great questions from the community, everyone.
Thank you.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and keep an eye out for Viktor at the nearest conference. I heard that he would really appreciate if you come up to him and say, "You were so good in that podcast and you're so good in that talk. When can I see you again?"
And he will do a selfie with you.
He will absolutely. A
Yeah,
streaming
this is
selfie.
what I know of, doing selfie. Thanks for having me here. Extremely excited. Hopefully not last time. I really hope that you guys will like this episode, and this is why you tell, hey, bring Viktor more. It's awesome. Thank you.
You are awesome, and I'll gladly have you back any day.
Thanks, Quinn.